The mud, it clawed at his bare feet, cold and grasping, like the skeletal fingers of forgotten things. The air, it was a suffocating shroud, thick with the stench of decay, of blooming night jasmine, and of something far more potent, fear. Raw. Unadulterated. A taste of iron on his tongue, not from blood, but from the very desperation that fueled his flight. His heart, a frantic drum against his ribs, a desperate Morse code of survival. Run. Hide. What? What if your very breath, your very existence was a crime? What if the only freedom you knew lay in the heart of a predator's domain, where every rustle could be a pursuer and every shadow a hunter? Elijah. That was his name. A name whispered only in prayer, only in the deepest hollows of his mind, where ownership couldn't reach. To the world that sought to shackle him, he was merely boy, property, field hand. But tonight, under the indifferent gaze of a sliver moon, he was a ghost. A whisper. A fugitive. His escape hadn't been an act of bravado, but of utter soul-crushing necessity. Another beating, another humiliation, another day watching a loved one disappear into the unforgiving maw of the auction block. The chains, still a phantom weight on his wrists, had been a constant, grinding promise of death. Or something worse. He remembered the coldness of them, the raw bite of iron against skin, the faint, metallic scent that always seemed to cling even after they were gone. A constant reminder of his status. His insignificance. But tonight, that coldness was replaced by the chill of swamp water, seeping into his tattered trousers, raising gooseflesh on his arms. This was a different cold. A living cold. A cold that promised concealment, even as it threatened hypothermia. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, painting the sky in violent hues of crimson and bruised purple, a theatrical backdrop to his desperate theater. He'd waited. Waited for the perfect confluence of shadow and opportunity. The guards, lulled by stale whiskey and the predictable rhythm of their own cruel boredom, had left a gate ajar. A mere crack. A whisper of possibility. And in that whisper, Elijah had seen not just a path, but a lifeline that he'd moved like a shadow, limbs stiff from a day's labor, but propelled by an unholy surge of adrenaline. The rough cotton of his shirt, sweat-soaked and clinging, had scraped against the splintered wood of the fence. A nail, rusty and jagged, had torn a ragged furrow in his side, a searing line of pain. He hadn't flinched, hadn't cried out. The agony was a minor chord in the symphony of terror that now consumed him. A small price for a chance. A chance at something. The first few yards had been a blur of hedgerows and dense undergrowth, the rough bark of trees scraping his face, the stinging branches whipping at his eyes. He'd run until his lungs burned, until the air felt like liquid fire, until his vision swam with dizzying spots. But the memory of the lash, the image of his mother's tear-streaked face, the haunting echo of his sister's plea, these were the fuel. They pushed him beyond exhaustion, beyond fear, into a realm of pure, unadulterated will. He was no longer just a man, he was a prayer in motion. The swamp. It was a place of legends and nightmares, whispered tales of lost souls and monstrous creatures. To those who owned the land, it was an impassable barrier, a tangled web of disease and death. To Elijah it was refuge, his only hope. He remembered the old folks, their eyes wide with stories by the firelight, speaking of hidden paths, of moss-draped sanctuaries, of ways to vanish into the green maw and never be seen again. He clung to those stories now like a drowning man to a splintered plank. The air here was different. Heavy. Humid. Scented with the sweet decay of fallen leaves, the earthy musk of mud, and the cloying perfume of water hyacinths. It was a primordial scent, ancient and potent, a fragrance that spoke of life and death intertwined. Spanish moss, like the silvery beards of old men, hung from ancient cypress trees, swaying gently in the barely perceptible breeze. Their knobby knees, gnarled and dark, jutted from the murky water, silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the deep. Every step was a gamble. The ground beneath him was treacherous, a shifting mosaic of solid earth, sinking mud and hidden roots. One misstep, and he could be swallowed whole, tangled in the swamp's embrace, a meal for unseen things. He moved with a hunter's caution, despite being the hunted. His bare feet, toughened by years of labor, now served as his eyes, feeling for purchase, testing the ground before committing his weight. A profound loneliness settled upon him, heavy as the night air. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. No familiar face, no comforting hand, no whispered word of encouragement. Only the relentless thrum of his own fear, and the symphony of the swamp, which seemed to mock his desperate struggle with its indifferent beauty. He thought of his mother, her gentle touch, the lullabies she sang that were the only moments of peace he'd ever known. Would he ever see her again? The thought was a raw wound, threatening to break his fragile resolve. But despair was a luxury he could not afford. Not yet. Not while the thrumming of a single word echoed in his very bones. Freedom. There it was. The sound that twisted his gut into a cold knot. The sound that sent a jolt of ice through his veins, hotter than any fever. The hounds. Their baying, mournful and relentless, carried on the humid night air, cutting through the natural cacophony of the swamp. It wasn't just a sound, it was a promise. A promise of pursuit, of capture, of a brutal return to the living death he had just fled. He froze, every muscle tensed, listening. His heart hammered, a frantic sparrow trapped in a cage. How close? How many? He couldn't tell. The swamp played tricks with sound, muffling some, amplifying others. But there was no mistaking the intent behind that haunting cry. It was the sound of unleashed primal instinct, guided by human cruelty that he forced himself to move, pushing deeper, faster. The reeds, tall and sharp, whipped at his face, leaving stinging welts. The mud sucked at his feet, each step an arduous effort. He splashed through stagnant pools, disturbing unseen creatures that scuttled away in protest. He knew these dogs. He'd seen them on the plantation, hulking brutes with yellow eyes and teeth like razors, bred for one purpose, to hunt human beings. To drag them back, broken and terrified that a wave of nausea washed over him. He wanted to scream. To collapse. To give up. The sheer futility of it all threatened to overwhelm him. What was one man, barefoot and unarmed, against a pack of trained hounds and the men who wielded them like weapons? But then he saw it. A faint shimmer in the darkness. A tiny speck of starlight reflected on a dew-kissed leaf. A reminder that even in the darkest night, there was light. He wouldn't. He couldn't. He had come too far. Endured too much. The pain in his side, the ache in his muscles, the burning in his lungs, it was all secondary. His primary directive, burned into his very soul, was to survive. He would not return. Not to the chains. Not to the lash. Not to the endless, suffocating despair. The dogs were a symphony of terror now, their barks interspersed with the hoarse shouts of men. He could almost feel their hot breath on his heels, their cruel joy in the chase. He imagined their leering faces, the glint of their lanterns, the heavy thud of their boots on firmer ground. They would be armed. They would be angry. And they would show no mercy. A twig snapped, close. Too close. He plunged into a dense thicket of saw palmetto, its spiky fronds tearing at his clothes, scratching his skin. He didn't care. He curled into a ball, trying to make himself small, insignificant, melting into the shadows. He held his breath, every nerve ending screaming. He could hear the thrashing of the dogs, their excited yelps just beyond the screen of vegetation. One dog, larger than the others, burst through the palmetto, its nose to the ground, sniffing frantically. Its eyes, phosphorescent in the gloom, gleamed with predatory intent. It was mere feet away. Elijah could feel the vibration of its snuffling, hear the shallow, eager pants. He squeezed his eyes shut, picturing his mother's face. Don't move. Don't breathe. Be still. The dog circled, its tail wagging with frustrated excitement. It sniffed at the air, its powerful senses trying to pinpoint him. Elijah could almost feel its wet nose against his skin. The stench of dog, a musky, eager scent, filled his nostrils. He prayed. Not to any specific god, but to the very essence of life, to the swamp itself, to swallow him whole, to hide him, to make him invisible. And then, a miracle. A low whistle. A command from one of the overseers. The dog reluctantly moved on, following its pack. They were searching just ahead, their sounds fading slightly but still alarmingly close. Elijah slowly, painstakingly, uncurled himself, his muscles screaming in protest. A wave of dizziness washed over him, but he fought it down. He was alive. For now. But the reprieve was fleeting. A momentary pause in the relentless hunt, the terror had left him trembling, his limbs weak, his body slick with sweat and swamp water. He felt an almost unbearable urge to simply lie down, to let the swamp claim him, to end the desperate chase. The thought was seductive, a dark lullaby promising oblivion. But then a flash. A flicker. The memory of a conversation. Old man Silas, his voice raspy with age and wisdom, talking about the runaway's trail. A whisper of a hidden path, used by those who dared to flee, a path known only to a few, a path that led deeper into the swamp, where the hunters dared not tread. Silas had spoken of a particular cluster of ancient cypress trees, their roots weaving like a basket above the water, forming a natural arch. And beyond that, a small, elevated island, a whisper of solid ground amidst the endless mire. A place where a man could rest, if only for a moment. A place where the scent of man was harder to track, washed away by the currents, obscured by the dense canopy. Elijah pushed through the water, ignoring the leeches that clung to his legs, the thorns that tore at his skin. He focused on Silas's words, on the image of those cypress roots. It was a needle in a haystack, a prayer in the wilderness, but it was something. It was a direction. A purpose beyond mere panicked flight. He pulled himself onto a gnarled root, his muscles screaming, and crawled forward, eyes straining into the impenetrable darkness, searching for a sign. The moon, now a slender crescent, offered little light, its silver glow barely piercing the thick canopy. But his eyes, accustomed to the gloom, began to discern shapes. The twisted forms of trees, draped in Spanish moss, took on monstrous visages in the half-light. Every rustle of a branch, every splash of a frog, sent fresh jolts of fear through him. But the hope, fragile as a butterfly wing, kept him moving. He imagined Silas's knowing smile, his quiet strength. He imagined the taste of freedom, and then he saw it. A tangle of roots, thicker than any he'd seen, weaving together like giant, arthritic fingers, creating an archway above the dark water. Silas's words echoed in his mind, a beacon in the terrifying night. This was it. The entrance to the labyrinth. He pulled himself up, his body protesting every movement, and slipped through the natural gateway. The change was immediate. The water beneath his feet became shallower, firmer. The air, though still humid, felt somehow cleaner, less cloying. And there, ahead, was a patch of elevated ground, perhaps 20 feet across, shielded by a dense thicket of palmettos and ancient oaks. Silas's island. A sanctuary. He collapsed, sprawling onto the damp earth, his chest heaving, his body shaking uncontrollably. The sheer exhaustion was monumental, a weight pressing him into the ground. He tasted the salt of his tears mixed with the sweat and mud on his face. He allowed himself a moment. Just a moment. To breathe. To feel the relative safety of this hidden place. The sounds of the hunt, though still present, seemed to recede, muffled by the dense foliage, the water, the sheer isolation of this spot. That he closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of his remaining strength. He visualized the route he'd taken, the landmarks, the turns. He had to remember. He had to find his way out. He thought of the stars, hidden by the canopy but still there, guiding lights in a world gone dark. He was a small, fragile creature, lost in a vast and dangerous world, but he was moving. He was fighting. And that, in itself, was a triumph. That he allowed himself a moment of fleeting, desperate hope. Perhaps he could evade them here. Perhaps the swamp, his reluctant ally, would truly swallow him, make him disappear. The thought was a fragile comfort, a flicker against the encroaching darkness. The fragile peace was shattered, ripped apart by the relentless baying of the hounds. They were closer again. They hadn't given up. They wouldn't. This was their purpose, their cruel game. And the men were just as relentless, just as driven by their own twisted sense of purpose. Elijah pressed himself against the rough bark of an oak, trying to become one with the tree. His eyes darted through the gloom, searching, waiting. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves sounded like an approaching footstep. His mind, already frayed by exhaustion and terror, began to play tricks on him. He imagined faces in the patterns of the moss, heard whispers on the wind that weren't there. A branch snapped. A heavy splash. Someone was approaching his island. He could feel the vibrations through the ground. His breath hitched in his throat. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had nothing to fight with. No knife. No stick. Only his raw will. This is it, he thought. This is where it ends. The despair, a heavy shroud, threatened to engulf him. He pictured the whiplash, the cruel laughter, the return to the endless, back-breaking toil. No, not again. He wouldn't go back. Not alive. If they found him, he would fight. He would make them work for it. He would not simply surrender his dignity, his nascent hope. The words, vile and dehumanizing, were a fresh lash. Runaway smell. As if freedom itself carried a stench. He forced himself to remain utterly, impossibly still. He could hear the men moving around the perimeter of his small island, their heavy boots splashing through the water, their lanterns casting dancing shadows. The dogs whined and sniffed, their hot breath almost palpable. He was trapped. A rat in a maze with no escape. The air grew thick with tension, palpable as the swamp mist. He could feel their presence, their menacing energy. They were searching methodically, their movements slow and deliberate. They knew he was close. They were toying with him, enjoying the psychological torture of the hunt. Every fiber of his being screamed to move, to bolt, to escape. But he knew that was exactly what they wanted. He forced himself to become stone, to become part of the tree. He focused on the rough texture of the bark against his cheek, the damp earth beneath his hand, anything to ground him, to prevent him from unraveling. A man passed within arm's reach, his lantern casting a momentary pool of light that illuminated a patch of his tattered trousers, his exposed skin. Elijah didn't flinch, didn't breathe. He could feel the man's gaze sweeping over the spot where he lay, could almost feel the heat of the lantern. He heard the man grunt, then move on, a frustrated curse muttered under his breath. Adrenaline surged through him, cold and sharp. He had been seen. And yet he hadn't. He had become invisible. His will, his sheer desperate need to survive, had forged a temporary shield. But how long could it last? How long could he hold his breath, stillness incarnate, against the relentless scrutiny of his pursuers? Damn it. He's vanished like smoke. The trail's gone cold here. The words were music to his ears, sweeter than any melody. The trail gone cold. The swamp had worked its magic. The complex currents, the thick mud, the overwhelming sense of wild growth, they had all conspired to erase his tracks, to confuse the hounds, to frustrate the men. He could feel their frustration, their anger, radiating from their voices. They were giving up on this immediate area. Slowly, grudgingly, the sounds of the hunt began to recede. The baying grew fainter, the shouts more distant. They were moving on, perhaps convinced he had somehow doubled back, or simply vanished into the deeper, more dangerous parts of the swamp. Elijah waited. He waited until the last faint echo of their voices had dissolved into the night, until only the croaking of frogs and the chirping of crickets remained. He finally allowed himself to breathe, a long, shuddering gasp that felt like it tore his lungs. He lay there, utterly spent, his body a trembling wreck, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had survived. He had outsmarted them. He had made it through the most harrowing part of the night. He lifted his head, gazing into the inky blackness above, where the branches of the cypress and oak trees formed a cathedral ceiling. A tiny sliver of moon, now a little higher, cast a faint, ethereal glow through a break in the canopy. For a moment, just a moment, the swamp felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. A place of hidden beauty, of raw, untamed life. That he saw the glint of fireflies, tiny stars dancing in the darkness, their silent choreography a stark contrast to the violence he had just escaped. He smelled the night-blooming jasmine, its heady perfume almost intoxicating. He felt the cool, damp earth against his cheek, a grounding presence after the terror. The swamp was cruel, yes, but it was also impartial. It offered no judgment, only challenges. And in its depths, it offered concealment. The immediate danger had passed, but the cost was evident. He moved a hand to his side where the fence nail had torn him. His fingers came away sticky with blood, dark against his skin. His arms and legs were a crisscross of scratches and scrapes, testament to his desperate dash through the undergrowth. His feet, bare and swollen, throbbed with every beat of his heart. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, seeped into his bones. But the physical wounds were almost secondary. The deeper cuts were emotional. The dehumanizing words of the overseer, the primal fear instilled by the hounds, the crushing weight of being hunted like an animal. These were the scars that would linger, etched into his soul. He closed his eyes and saw again the glint of the lantern, the snapping jaws of the dog, the sneering face of the overseer. The memories were vivid, searing. He thought of his sister Martha. Younger than him, with eyes like deep pools and a laugh that could chase away any shadow. He had promised her he would be free. Promised her he would find a way back or send word or somehow, someday carve out a path for her too. That promise, heavy as lead, yet light as a feather, was his true burden, his true fuel. It was a promise that demanded he survive, that demanded he endure. He knew he couldn't stay here. This was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. Dawn would break soon, bringing with it renewed danger. He needed to keep moving, to keep pushing, to honor that promise. He clenched his jaw, taking a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of fear and the earthy scent of the swamp. He was still here. Still fighting. The first faint blush of false dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky, a subtle shift in the darkness, promising the return of light. And with it, renewed visibility for his pursuers. He had to be gone. Had to be deeper, farther, before the sun crested the horizon. He surveyed his surroundings. The dense thicket around him, the network of roots. He remembered Silas's other lessons. Move with the water. Use the natural channels. The swamp always tells you where it wants to go. He needed to find a deeper channel, a natural runoff, something that would carry his scent away, obscure his tracks further, and lead him west towards the rumored hidden communities, the elusive Maroons, who had carved out their own defiant existence in the heart of the wilderness. That he pushed himself to his feet, his muscles stiff, protesting. Every movement was a deliberate act of will. He ignored the throbbing in his feet, the ache in his side. He was a machine now, programmed for one purpose: locomotion, survival. Freedom. That he found a narrow gap in the palmetto thicket, leading to a slightly wider channel of dark, sluggish water. This was his path. He stepped into the cool water, letting it envelop his legs, hoping it would wash away the last lingering traces of his passage, the faint human scent that the dogs would inevitably pick up again. The water was his ally now, but also his challenge. It was slow going. Every step was weighted, every motion an effort. But the thought of escape, of a life free from the lash, free from the ownership, pulled him forward. He was moving not just physically but spiritually. Each step was a defiance, a silent scream against injustice. The first rays of sun, pale and hesitant, pierced through the dense canopy, dappling the water with shifting patterns of light and shadow. The swamp, which had been a place of terrifying darkness, now transformed into a landscape of verdant greens and shimmering blues, deceptively beautiful. Elijah paused, leaning against the smooth trunk of a watergum tree, its bark peeling in papery layers. He looked around him, his heart a strange mix of terror and triumph. He had survived the night. The dogs were gone. The men were gone. He was still in the heart of the swamp, still surrounded by danger, but the immediate threat had passed, but the victory was bittersweet. He was free, yes, but free into what? Into a wilderness that offered no easy path, no promise of safety, only more challenges. The weight of his freedom was a new kind of burden, a heavy cloak of responsibility. He was no longer just running from something, he was running towards something. A future unknown, forged by his own desperate will. That he thought of his mother's prayers, his sister's laughter, the quiet dignity of old man Silas. They were with him, ghosts of the past, guiding lights for the future. He would carry their memories, their hopes, with him through every arduous step, every hungry day, every sleepless night. He would carry the weight of his history and transform it into the strength of his future. The story of Elijah, of that one terrifying night in the swamp, is not unique. It is a story told in 1,000 different voices, across countless generations. It is the story of every soul who dared to dream of liberty in a land that denied their very humanity. It is the story of every runaway, every fugitive, every man, woman, and child who placed their entire being on the altar of freedom, facing untold horrors for a chance at dignity. They were hunted, yes, with dogs and men, with whips and chains, with laws designed to crush their spirit. They were chased through fields of cotton, through dense forests, across raging rivers, and into the unforgiving maw of the swamp. But in every desperate flight, in every hidden breath, in every defiant step, they were also forging something powerful. They were forging resilience. They learned to read the stars, to navigate by the moss on the trees, to distinguish between the cries of a harmless bird and the distant baying of a hound. They learned to hide in plain sight, to become one with the earth, to find sustenance in the barren wilderness. They built communities of defiance, whispered networks of hope, a tapestry woven from courage and a shared yearning for liberation. Their terror was real, their suffering immense, but it was in that crucible of fear that an unbreakable spirit was forged. The echoes of that terror, of that night in the swamp, do not simply fade into history. They ripple forward, through time, shaping the very fabric of our present. The fear of pursuit, the burden of unjust laws, the fight for basic human dignity, these are not relics of a distant past, but living, breathing realities for countless individuals even today. For the Black experience in particular, the runaway's terror is more than a historical footnote. It is a foundational trauma, an ancestral memory woven into the collective consciousness. It is the origin story of a resilience that has defied centuries of oppression. It is the wellspring of a profound understanding of what it means to struggle for freedom, to demand recognition, to insist on humanity in the face of dehumanization. When we witness acts of systemic injustice today, when we see individuals fighting for their rights, when we hear the calls for equality and liberation, we are hearing the echoes of Elijah's desperate breath in the swamp. We are seeing the continued legacy of a spirit that refused to be broken, that chose freedom, even at the cost of everything. The courage to run, the will to survive, the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow? These are the powerful gifts bequeathed by those who endured the unimaginable. The night in the swamp, though filled with terror, also gave birth to an unyielding strength, a profound capacity for hope that continues to illuminate the path forward. Elijah's night in the swamp, a solitary struggle against overwhelming odds, is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. It reminds us of the profound cost of freedom, the depths of human cruelty, and the soaring heights of courage. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past, but also to recognize the incredible strength born from that struggle. As we reflect on this harrowing journey, on the mud, the mosquitoes, the baying hounds, and the unyielding will of a man desperate to be free, we are left with a powerful, unsettling question. In a world still grappling with systemic inequalities, with the lingering shadows of historical injustices, what lessons can we today draw from the terror and the triumph of the runaway? And how can we honor their fight by ensuring that true freedom, dignity, and humanity are not just whispered dreams, but lived realities for all?